Martha Collins lived alone in a quiet little farmhouse at the end of a dusty road. The wooden porch creaked whenever the wind blew, and the only sound she usually heard was the soft ticking of the old clock above her fireplace. Her husband, Henry, had passed away 10 years ago, leaving her with nothing but his favorite chair, a few photographs, and a house that had grown too silent. She used to bake bread every morning for him. Now she still baked it sometimes, out of habit, but most of it went stale. Martha had no children, no close friends, and no one who came by anymore. The neighbors waved politely, but no one stopped to talk. She had grown used to the loneliness, though sometimes she wished for someone to talk to, just someone who would say her name again. One chilly morning in late autumn, Martha put on her faded coat and drove to the small town market. She needed flour and a few vegetables. The sun was barely up and a thin mist hugged the fields. As she drove along the narrow road by the old railway, something unusual caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a bundle of clothes left on the fence, but as her truck got closer, her heart began to race. The shapes were too still, too small. She stopped the truck and stepped out, clutching her coat tighter against the cold. Her boots sank slightly into the muddy ground. When she reached the wooden fence, she froze. 3 children were tied there, 2 girls and a boy. They looked thin, cold, and frightened. The oldest couldn't have been more than 7. The smallest, maybe 4. Their clothes were torn, their hands dirty, and their faces pale from hunger. The middle one, a boy, had his arm around the youngest girl, trying to shield her from the wind. Martha's throat tightened as she realized they weren't playing or hiding. They had been left there. A piece of paper fluttered against the fence post, held by a bit of twine. Martha leaned closer and read the words written in shaky letters. "Can't feed them anymore. Please, someone take them." For a long moment, she just stood there, unable to move. The words echoed in her mind. She looked at the children again. The oldest girl stared back at her eyes wide and scared but also tired, like someone who had seen too much for her age. The little boy clutched the youngest tighter when Martha took a step closer. The smallest girl whimpered softly, a sound so faint that it broke Martha's heart. She knelt down slowly so she wouldn't frighten them. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "I won't hurt you," but they didn't answer. They just watched her with blank faces, unsure if they could trust this stranger. Martha's hands shook slightly. She had no idea what to do. She pulled out her phone and called the local sheriff. When Sheriff Daniels arrived, he looked at the children with a heavy sigh. "This kind of thing's been happening more," he said quietly. "Times are hard. Some folks just can't manage." He promised to take them to the city orphanage the next morning. Martha nodded, though something in her chest felt uneasy. She wanted to take them right then to keep them safe, but she didn't know how. She was just one old woman living alone. What could she possibly give them? That night, Martha couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the children's faces. She kept hearing the smallest girl's whimper, the sound of fear and hunger. She turned on the lamp, looked at the empty chair across from her, and whispered, "Henry, what would you have done?" The silence answered her back. Around midnight, she got up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and sat by the window. Outside, the moonlight fell across the fields, silver and still, and then she made a decision she didn't fully understand herself. At dawn, she drove back to the railway fence. The road was quiet, the sky just turning pale pink. As her truck rolled to a stop, she could see the 3 children still there. The sheriff hadn't come yet. Their heads were bowed, and they looked even weaker than before. Martha's heart ached. She climbed out and walked toward them, her breath visible in the cold air. The oldest girl lifted her head when she heard footsteps. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Are you taking us away?" Martha knelt in front of them, her voice gentle. "Do you remember who left you here?" The girl shook her head slowly, eyes welling up with tears. "Mama said she'd come back." "But she didn't." Martha swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. She reached out to untie the ropes, her fingers working carefully so she wouldn't hurt them. "You shouldn't be out here," she murmured. "You'll catch your death in this cold." The little boy finally spoke, his voice small and rough. "Are you going to take us to the big house?" He meant the orphanage, Martha realized. She paused and looked at their faces. 3 small lives that had been thrown away like they were nothing. Then she looked into the eyes of the youngest girl. The child had big brown eyes filled with tears and confusion. Martha smiled softly, trying to comfort her. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl didn't answer right away. She looked down, fidgeting with the loose end of the rope still tied around her wrist. Then, in a whisper so faint Martha almost missed it, she said, "Martha." Martha blinked. For a second, she thought she'd misheard. "What did you say, darling?" The little girl looked up and repeated, "Martha." The world seemed to stop. The old widow felt something deep inside her stir, something warm, something she hadn't felt in years. It was like hearing her own name through the mouth of an angel. Her heart began to beat faster. She had always believed names carried meaning, and now here in front of her was a child calling her name when no one else had for years. It felt like a sign, a message from above, maybe even from her late husband. Martha smiled through the tears that suddenly filled her eyes. "Well," she said softly, "it looks like we were meant to find each other." Without waiting for permission, she gathered all three of them close. They were cold and shivering, but they didn't pull away. She wrapped them in her blanket and carried the smallest one to her truck, helping the other two climb in. The oldest girl asked in a shaky voice, "Where are we going?" "Home," Martha said firmly. "You're coming home with me." The drive back was quiet. The children sat huddled together in the front seat, their wide eyes watching the road ahead. Martha glanced at them now and then, her heart heavy and full all at once. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if the law would allow her to keep them. But in that moment she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let them be taken away again. When they reached her farmhouse, she led them inside and sat them by the warm fireplace. She brought out bread and milk, the simplest meal she had, and watched them eat like they hadn't seen food in days. The youngest, the one who shared her name, fell asleep in the chair with crumbs still on her lips. The boy leaned against the wall, his eyes drooping with exhaustion. The oldest sat quietly, staring into the flames. Martha covered them all with an old quilt and whispered, "You're safe now. No one will hurt you again." As the night deepened, she sat watching them sleep, the fire flickering softly. The loneliness that had filled her home for 10 long years seemed to fade. For the first time in a long while, Martha didn't feel empty. She felt needed. Outside, the cold wind blew over the fields, carrying the faint cry of a faraway train. Inside, by the firelight, an old woman and 3 abandoned children began to heal without even knowing it. Something new had started that night, something that would change all their lives forever. Morning sunlight touched the edges of the small farmhouse, slowly filling the room with warmth. Martha opened her eyes and looked toward the living room. The 3 children were still asleep under the quilt, huddled together like little kittens. The sight made her smile. It had been many years since her house had felt alive. She stood quietly, not wanting to wake them, and began preparing breakfast. Warm porridge with honey and a pot of tea. The smell filled the house, mixing with the crackling sound of the fireplace. For once, it didn't feel like a house made for one. It felt like a home again. When the children woke, they looked confused at first. The smallest girl, little Martha, rubbed her eyes and whispered, "Are we still here?" The old woman smiled gently. "Yes, sweetheart. You're safe. You're home now." The girl looked around as if trying to believe it. Then she smiled too, shy and small. But it was the first real smile Martha had seen on her face. Over the next few days, things slowly changed. The oldest girl said her name was Lily. She spoke carefully, as if afraid of saying too much. The boy's name was Ben, and though he rarely spoke, he always made sure his sisters were close to him. Little Martha followed the widow everywhere. When she fed the chickens, when she baked bread, when she watered the garden. Sometimes the child would hold the edge of Martha's skirt and just walk beside her quietly. It filled the old woman's heart with warmth she hadn't known in years. Still, there were difficult moments. On the 3rd night, Ben woke screaming. He was shaking and crying, calling out for his mother. Martha rushed into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, holding him close until his sobs softened. "You're safe, my boy," she whispered again and again. "No one will hurt you here." Lily sat up too, eyes wet, and asked softly, "Can we stay? You won't send us away, will you?" Martha looked at her and said, "You're not going anywhere. This is your home now." From that night, the children began to trust her more. Martha started giving each of them small chores. Lily helped wash dishes and fold laundry. Ben fed the hens and learned to chop wood. Little Martha collected eggs and sang to herself while following the older ones. In the evenings, they all sat together by the fireplace. Martha would read from an old storybook she had kept since her husband's time. The children listened with wide eyes, especially little Martha, who liked the stories about brave animals and kind people. When the old woman finished reading, they often asked her to tell them about her husband. So she spoke softly about Henry, the man who loved fixing old clocks and planting sunflowers. The children listened as if he were a character from a fairy tale. One afternoon, as Martha hung clothes on the line, she saw Lily trying to copy her. The girl's fingers fumbled with the clothespins, but she smiled proudly when she managed to clip one shirt perfectly. "Look, Mrs. Collins," she said. Martha walked over, looked at the line, and smiled. "You can call me Grandma if you'd like." Lily's eyes widened. "Really?" Martha nodded. From that day on, all three children began calling her Grandma, and the sound of it made her eyes glisten every time. The townspeople started to notice the change. They would see Martha walking through town with the three children following her, laughing and holding hands. The same woman who had once looked lonely and sad now walked with a light in her step. Some people whispered in surprise, wondering how the widow managed with three young ones, but others smiled warmly. Even the sheriff stopped by once and said, "Looks like those little ones gave you back your spirit, Martha." She only smiled and replied, "Maybe they were sent to me for that reason." As weeks turned into months, the farmhouse transformed. The once quiet halls now echoed with laughter and the sound of small footsteps. There were muddy boots near the door, crayon drawings on the kitchen table, and half-finished puzzles by the window. Martha would sometimes pause in the middle of her chores and just listen. The sound of life around her felt like music. One winter evening, a social worker from the city arrived. She had come to check on the children. She asked questions, looked around the house, and took notes. Martha felt nervous, afraid they might take the children away. But the woman smiled after a while. "You've given them a good home," she said kindly. "They're healthy and happy. If you wish, Mrs. Collins, you can apply to adopt them officially." Martha's heart trembled. She looked at the three children playing by the fireplace. They were her family now, whether or not any paper said it. But the thought of making it official made her eyes fill with tears. "Yes," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." The process took time, but eventually it became real. The papers were signed, and the children became hers in name and heart. On the day it happened, she baked a big pie and let them eat as much as they wanted. Ben hugged her tightly and whispered, "Thank you for choosing us." Martha held him close and said, "No, my boy. It was you who chose me." Life moved on gently after that. Every morning, the children went to the little school nearby. Every evening, they returned home with stories to tell. Lily loved reading and wanted to be a teacher one day. Ben loved fixing things and spent hours helping Martha repair old tools. Little Martha grew into a bright and cheerful girl who loved to draw pictures of the family, always including a man she imagined as Grandpa Henry. Martha hung each drawing on the wall proudly. Sometimes, when she walked by the old railway fence where she had found them, she would stop and look at it quietly. The wooden posts were still there, though the ropes were long gone. Now wildflowers grew all around it. The place that had once been filled with sadness had turned into a place of peace. Martha always carried a few extra flowers from her garden to leave there. "Thank you," she would whisper, not sure who she was speaking to. Maybe fate, maybe heaven, maybe Henry. Years later, when the children were older, the family gathered around the same fireplace one evening. Lily was reading aloud from a book, while Ben played softly on a harmonica he had found in a shop. Little Martha, now almost grown, sat beside the widow and asked, "Grandma, why did you take us that day?" "You didn't even know us." The old woman looked at her with gentle eyes and said, "Because one of you said my name when the world had forgotten it." The girl smiled and leaned her head against her shoulder. The fire crackled, and for a moment everything felt perfectly still and safe. As the night deepened, Martha looked at her family, the children she had saved, who in return had saved her. She thought of all the lonely years before them, all the quiet mornings when she wished for someone to talk to. Now she had three voices calling her name every day. Her house was filled with laughter and warmth, and her heart was full in a way she had never thought possible again. Outside, the stars shone over the fields and the wind whispered softly through the trees. Inside, an old woman and three children, once strangers, sat together as a family. The past no longer haunted her. The pain had been replaced by love, and every time she looked into their faces, she felt grateful for the day she stopped her truck by that fence. Life had given her something she didn't know she still needed, a second chance at love, at care, at belonging. And though time would pass and the children would grow up, one thing would never change. They would always be hers and she would always be theirs. And so the lonely widow who once lived in silence found her voice again in the laughter of 3 orphans who had called her name.